this, go over here and wait for us to come out from behind blue curtain. Come on. All right, we're live over there. Let me check YouTube real quick. We're live over here. The transition button. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I, your co-host, Buddy.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about, broadly, wizards and TTRPGs based on a thing. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
Based on a thing, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I decided midstream that I shouldn't give the full explanation. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
It is, yeah, it's a really complicated explanation. On this podcast, we like to talk about games, okay? And it's been a while since we've done a really crunchy tabletop, RPG episode, and I guess that's what we're doing today. Just like a super crunchy thing, because this is on the Pathfinder subreddit, right? On the Pathfinder subreddit,
technically on Twitter, but yes.
Technically on Twitter, right?
Technically on X.
Oh my God, kill my Michael Sayre, who is a design manager for Paizo, kind of broke out this thread where he had some really interesting thoughts about like wizards and spellcasters and class design and stuff like that. There's two of them. I linked them in the announcement on the Discord if you wanna like look and pay attention. But I'm just really interested in sort of the thought process here, because I think I disagree with, well, I don't know that I disagree. I
think a lot of this
I
would say I think a lot of this has to do with one of your favorite topics, which is class fantasy, right? Mm-hmm. Which is what the core of this is. To kind of give a quick summary, basically Sayre's point is he's talking about PF1E, that the Arcanist was actually not as powerful as either. These classes were hybrid classes, and the Arcanist was supposed to be a hybrid between the Sorcerer and the Wizard. And his claim is that the Sorcerer and the Wizard are not, or rather the Arcanist is not as powerful as either the Wizard or the Sorcerer, but it is easier to use, and so it led to the perception of it being more powerful. And it goes into this kind of long thing, primarily about basically spellcaster fantasy archetypes, right? Like class fantasies is probably the right term to use. And also the relative power levels around them. Basically being that like the wizards are very powerful because you always have a lot of tools available to you. Whereas sorcerers kind of get a little bit more of that kind of like mage kind of like fantasy. And then he brings to mind that the kineticist is kind of like the pure blaster version, which is not a thing I had thought about before, but like I had always thought about kineticist as kind of like a bender from Avatar, but like it makes sense that like what they were trying to the fantasy they were trying to invoke was like kind of like the elemental wizard as a blaster, right? Like as like Lena from Dota, right? That kind of thing.
Where it's like you're hitting hard. You are ranged to deepest, okay, and you're doing the damage.
Specifically with like fireballs, right? Like you are the fireball wizard, right? You are the, I think this is kind of mostly the mold that like a World of Warcraft wizard falls into, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting thinking about this in sort of World of Warcraft terms, but I'm going to leave that on the table for a second, because I am interested in your thoughts on the core conceit. Like, do you agree? I think I disagree with him about Arcanist, Wizard, and Sorcerer for a kind of fundamental way that I'm sure it will. It's like a framing issue. I think we're all describing the exact same thing, but in my opinion, he is ascribing power to something, or ascribing away power from something that I think generates power, if that makes sense, right?
Interesting.
Here is let me see if I can. What did he actually say about? The Arcanist was regarded by many to be a very strong class. The thing is, it actually wasn't. For a player with even a modicum of system mastery, the Arcanist was a strictly worse than either of the classes who informed its design, the Wizard and the Sorcerer. The Sorcerer had significantly more spells to draw around, and the Wizard had both a faster spell progression and more versatility in its ability to prepare for a wide variety of encounters. Both classes were strictly better than the Arcanist if you knew PF1 well enough to play them to their potential. This is his core claim. I disagree with this, right? Because, and I think this would be the argument that like a piezo designer would give to say that all three of these are quote unquote balanced, right? Which is the flexibility is power, right? If that makes sense. And I feel like he maybe will have it, kind of address this a little bit later on, but I want to set the stage for people who don't necessarily know. So in Pathfinder 1E, right, the advantage of playing a sorcerer is you get the most number of spell slots, right? You can cast more than anyone else can cast. However, the downside is you can only cast from a list of strict spells that you know, and you cannot alter that list easily if you ever alter it at all, right?
Well,
Generally speaking,
you can't alter it in a short time frame.
correct. Yes. You alter it on level ups, which is the kind of thing that happens once every couple of sessions, and you alter it in incredibly minor ways, right? Where you like get rid of one or two,
And it's a small pool to begin with, right? Like it's like I think it caps out like
yes.
3 per level.
Yeah. A wizard is sort of the opposite. Wizards get fewer numbers of spell to casts, but there's actually a third track here, which is that sorcerers also get higher level spells slower. So a 5th level wizard is going to get level 3 spells, but I think a 6th level sorcerer gets spells, right? It's just a tiny bit slower to get the stronger level of spell slots. A wizard gets a faster progression, and and I'm sorry, one last thing about sorcerers have essentially at will. They can cast at any time any spell they want in their spell slot. They just cast it, right? That's it. It's good. They cast it, kind of thing. Wizards are prepared spellcasters, so they get a faster progression and a much wider variety of spells. Wizards can literally cast everything on their list if they have it in their spellbook. Theoretically, a limiting resource, but nobody ever plays it that way, right? You have a functionally infinite resource of spells if you're playing a wizard, right? They are limited though by preparation. At the beginning of a day, a wizard needs to prepare all of the spells that they are going to cast in that day, and they cannot alter that prepared list once it is set in stone, right? So if a wizard is going to wake up in an inn and he's going to go, you know what, I want to make sure I can cast a bunch of fireballs today. If he goes out adventuring and runs into a bunch of fire elementals that are immune to fire, he is out of luck. He cannot change those fireball spell slots to lightning bolt spell slots in order to deal damage to fire elementals. He just has to live with the fact that his fireballs aren't going to do any damage, and that is a essentially wasted spell slot for his day, right? The Arcanist threads the needle between the two of these, right? The Arcanist draws from the same list that the wizard does at the beginning of his day and prepares a spell list, right? But the spell list is one he can cast from fluidly. So, for instance, a wizard maybe prepares all fireballs in their 3rd level spell slot, right? So even though the wizard knows lightning bolt, he has only prepared fireballs, and each spell slot has to be a fireball when it casts it, essentially. An Arcanist can prepare both fireball and lightning bolt as his 3rd level spells from the day, but he can use all of his spell slots to do either or, right? Which is a little bit like the sorcerer, right? Except for he can alter this spell list every day, essentially.
Yeah, he gets a spell book like a wizard. But
he gets a spell book like with. There's other class features to all of this, but we're not going to get into any of that stuff, right? This is just about the spell casting nature of their casting, right? This is how all 3 classes
the Arcanist works like the way the wizard does in BG3, and I think in D&D 5e. Because just as a point of reference, I don't play a wizard in 5e, so I don't know if that's actually how.
So I actually don't think the Arcanist works the way. In Baldur's Gate, you can alter your prepared spells at any time. I guess that's.
I thought that was like a bug, right? Like, because like I thought like altering I thought you were only supposed to be able to alter your prepared spells. Like I thought they weren't supposed to take until you rested.
Okay.
Because otherwise you're just like a sorcerer with extra clicks. Right.
Yeah, that's also what I thought. I don't know if that's intended or a bug, but in Baldur's Gate, essentially, let's say it is a bug. That would be how an Arcanist works, right? Where The intention is at the beginning of your day, you set your prepared spell list, but you can cast any spell off of your spell list whenever, like
Assuming you have
at
the
whatever.
appropriate slot to cast it out of.
Exactly. Assuming you have the appropriate slot to cast it out of, right? If you have a third level spell slot, you can cast Fireball or Lightning Bolt as long as you prepared Fireball and Lightning Bolt as your spell list for that day. That's how Arcanist works. I understand the idea that he's getting at, right? Which is that on their face, it seems as though sorcerer and wizard are both more powerful, specifically because with sorcerer you just blast, right? You
Basically, or you
yeah,
do
like,
the thing that you build your character to do certain things well, and you do those things.
yeah. And wizards, one of the problems with wizards, probably the most frustrating thing if you're a wizard, right? Is this fireball situation that I'm kind of like talking about, where you prepare a list of spells, right? And then you walk into an encounter and maybe you have your fireball, but you roll low or something like that. You just roll all ones. Your fireball does 6 damage rather than 36 damage, that kind of thing, right? Or even an average of damage for what that'd be, right? If you're well, I guess you can cast a fireball at level 3. You'd have to do 5d6 at minimum. Let's say you cast your fireball. I'm sorry, 10d6. You cast your fireball, it deals 10 damage, right? This is absolute minimum damage. Wow, that sucks. You can't just cast another one, but a sorcerer can. A sorcerer can cast as many fireballs as he has spell slots, and if his first fireball whiffs, well, that's fine. Just keep casting more, basically. This is the benefit of playing a sorcerer. You can just keep casting. You have a lot of extra spell slots to cast from, which tends to translate to bigger output. The problem with sorcerer is that you don't have access to sort of like the really wide-ranging utility that a wizard has access to, where a wizard can prepare things in such a way that they kind of have access to both damage, but also like the extensive utility of just a massive arcane list, right? If you can defeat an encounter by gaseous form is a good example of this. This is like a pure utility spell, but like it's the kind of thing where if you're playing and you run into an issue where gaseous form solves a bunch of problems, a wizard who has prepared gaseous form is probably going to be doing way better than a sorcerer who has gaseous form on his spell list, because gaseous form is an uncommon enough utility spell that is kind of a waste of a wizard's or a sorcerer's spell known
Right.
a lot of the time. But a wizard can just prepare it when he thinks it's going to be useful, right? And when that happens, boom, he's good, and he kind of nails it. The thing about Arcanist that Michael Sayre is describing, he has this thing. He says what the Arcanist had going for it was that it was extremely forgiving. It didn't require anywhere near the same level of system mastery to excel. You can make a lot of more mistakes, both in building it and while playing it, and still feel powerful. You could adjust your plans a lot more easily on the fly if you hadn't done a very good job planning in advance. The class's ability to elevate the player rather than requiring the player to elevate the class made it quite popular and created the general impression that it was very strong. I do think that's just like a legitimate strength of the class. That flexibility is legitimate power, right? Because part of RPG design is being able to react to unknowns, right?
Sure.
Being able to, if you know what you're going to go fight you know every single session, that's probably boring and uninteresting, right? And part of what makes for a good strategic experience is dealing with unknowns as they crop up, right? And giving the Arcanist a wider array of power to pull from in order to deal with that is legitimate power. That's kind of my like piece that I disagreed with Michael Sayre about it, but I don't know how you felt.
Yeah. So I think like the I think his point. I think his point is correct in that if you know how to min max a wizard, it will be more powerful than an equivalent arcanist. Um, and I think that I think the thing you are talking about is true, but that's because to his point, right? Like without any system mastery, the arcanist is more powerful because they have that flexibility built in, and you don't have to think about it, right? Like an optimized wizard is fucking nuts, right? Like an optimized anything in Pathfinder is nuts. And I think part of the thing that I might slightly disagree with him. It's like the point. It's not because the Arcanist isn't doesn't have the potential to be as powerful. It's because the Arcanist came at the end of the PF1E life cycle and didn't have time for enough feats to build up to make it like to like do the thing to Arcanist that you could
just like make it like Giga Nuts, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, I do think the Arcanist is powerful for another reason, which is that when it comes to non-spellcasting power, I think the Arcanist has the most powerful engine outside of its spellcasting. The arcane points or whatever that it can spend, I think, is better than sorcerer class features most of the time, and it's absolutely better than wizard spell schools features, right? I think both of those are comparatively pretty weak, but the Arcanist has this really powerful like meta magic on the fly thing that it does with those points.
So the issue is that the school feature that is powerful for a wizard is mostly in the extra spell slot, right? You get an extra spell slot with like a spell of your school in it, right? Which is like actually very powerful because spell slots are a limited resource. But yeah,
because sorcerers can do some stuff that is like cool and neat, like draconic sorcerers turning into dragons, getting a fly speed, all that other kind of stuff. But I just feel like the ability to manipulate the way that your spells are being cast with those arcane points is really good. At least when we were talking about the Arcanist. But I think I see what you're saying, because something he talks about is skill ceiling and skill floor, which I do think is real, right? This is sort of like the League of Legends idea that like playing Master Yi at bronze is broke, like he's broken, right? And maybe playing, I don't know, Yasuo, Alistar, right? These traditionally high skill ceiling champions was much harder, right? And so even though you would never see Master Yi in an LCS game, Master Yi is still sort of balanced around this skill ceiling, skill floor stuff, which I think is sort of fair enough, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I get that. No, but I think that the kind of the more interesting part here, though, is like what feeds into like what players expect out of a thing called a wizard, and like that was actually probably the most important thing or the most interesting thing to me was like I was talking about the kineticist briefly before, right? Like if you called the kineticist a wizard, I could buy that, but like that has like so much like essentially psychological baggage attached to it. That's an issue for the system. Does that make sense? Like
yeah. So he talks about this fantasy. There's this fantasy piece.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this comes down to Vancian magic being very popular when D&D was invented, and is like not the way that anybody besides D&D players think about magic right now.
Yeah, it's been many years and editions of multiple games since things that were actually balance points in older editions were true of D20 spellcasters. D20 tabletop RPG wizards generally have a humongous breadth of spells available to every single individual spellcaster, and their only cohesive theme is magic. They are expected to be able to do almost anything except heal, and even specialists in most fantasy tabletop RPGs of the last couple decades are really generalists with an extra bit of flavor and flair in the form of an extra spell slot or ability dedicated to a particular theme. That's definitely very true, right?
Yeah.
Where it is about having being able to use a wizard to solve just like a gazillion different problems is like a very real thing. Where's the part where he talks about Jack Vance? Because that's in here and it is super interesting.
You do. Hold on, let me see.
So if you want the fantasy of a wizard and want a balanced game, but also don't want to have the game force you into having to use particular strategies to succeed, how do you square the circle? I suspect the best answer is change your idea of what a wizard must be. D20 fantasy tabletop RPG wizards are heavily influenced by the dominating presence of D&D and, to a significantly lesser degree, the works of Jack Vance. Jack Vance being a famous D&D, he's the Dragonlance guy, right?
Yeah, I mean, so Vancian magic comes out before D&D does, right? Like, and to a lesser extent, I think is like weirdly underselling it, just because it's like the thing that's influenced by Jack Vance is Vancian magic, and that's just the way that like people don't know that it's Vancian magic outside of people only know what Vancian magic is because that's the way that D&D does magic, is the way I would say it.
Oh wow, so he didn't actually write any D&D books, it looks like. But yeah, so Jack Vance basically he writes specifically around spells do specific things, right? And the things that they do are quantifiable and containable and make, you know, explicit sort of like sense. I think that's the is that the what's the best definition of Vancian magic you can.
So the important, like you said, like spells do very specific things, and the second part is that you memorize this, like the kind of like fantasy of it is you study the spell, you memorize it, and you store it in your mind kind of temporarily, and when it casts, it leaves your mind, so you are unable to cast it again, right? Like
Oh,
these,
sure, yeah.
yeah, like that, like again, like the way this is expressed in game terms is like spell slots and casting spells. So what the fantasy is supposed to be, which I think a lot of people don't kind of follow, is that the wizard is supposed to be like studying his tome and he memorizes how to do the spell, but that's only a temporary construct, right? It's like cramming before a test, essentially, right? And as soon as the test is over, as soon as you cast the spell, you can't remember it anymore. Except it's like less, it's like less fluid than that. It is like literally, the spell is a unit that gets stored in your brain, and the nature of the magic is such that it leaves your head and you can't remember. Like, it's not like a very advanced wizard would be able to remember like the spell anyway after it leaves his head. It's just kind of like the way that magic works, right?
Yeah.
um see the spells are very quantized is maybe the term I want to use, right?
Yeah, and so he goes on to say that Vance hasn't been a particularly popular fantasy author for several generations now, and many popular fantasy wizards don't have massively diverse bags of tricks and fire and forget spells. They often have a smaller bag of focused abilities that they get increasingly competent with maybe some expansions into specific new themes and abilities as they grow in power. The Pathfinder 2e Kineticist is an example of how limiting the theme and degree of a customization of a character can lead to an overall more satisfying and accessible play experience, right? This is you narrow, you kind of narrow your scope to really drill down into kind of a gameplay theme, and that's something that really connects with people, which I do think is very true, right? This is why I think paladins are people. I don't know that this is real, but I think people connect to the fantasy of a paladin more than they connect to the fantasy of like a war, right? Um, a paladin tends to carry a lot of weight on its own, a kind of class fantasy weight on its own, whereas a warrior or a fighter in D&D terms tends to be very much a cipher, right? You can
Yeah.
make a fighter into a million different things, right? It doesn't really have that sort of baggage, but a paladin is a very specific thing. And sure, you can have different oaths, right? Or in Pathfinder 2e, you're technically champions. Paladins are the lawful good version of it, right? Or whatever. I mean, I guess they're getting rid of alignments, but you could theoretically have like evil paladins. These are hell knights and stuff like that.
Hell Knights, it's anti paladins. Hell Knights are lawful, like are restrained on the lawful axis, but they are not specifically evil. They can be
what are
neutral.
what are anti paladins?
That so actually an anti paladin is chaotic evil. That is like the
Oh,
traditional
okay.
name for it.
Oh, right. I made a custom class for that. I made or not custom class. I think it was an archetype.
Yeah,
I
there's
made the Reaver archetype, which is the chaotic evil paladin who smites
I,
lawful.
I thought I could be wrong. What the champions all have these names, right? Like
Yeah.
champion PF2E. Let me see if I can find it. Because they had names for like the different
Yeah, another example of this might be cleric, right? Cleric, borrows a lot of its design and feel from sort of the flavor of whatever god,
right.
like you're kind of you're actually maybe the best example of this is actually kind of like monk. Monk is maybe the most sort of narrow. You kind of can't do anything with a monk except for like
I think that's I think that I think paladin might actually be it. Or
yeah.
maybe druid. Um because like I think
See,
monks.
druid, well, okay. It's part of this, I think, is that there's just a variety of stuff you can do, right?
Yeah,
With fighter, you can be a tank. You can go in with a greatsword and beat stick guys. You can be dual wielding,
you
like
can be an
piratey
archer.
kind of stuff. You can be an archer, right? A million different things. With a druid, you can be a shape changer. You can turn into a bear.
You can be
You're a
like
big beefcake.
like a storm caster essentially,
Yeah, you can
right?
be like a blaster calling lightning. You can be like a healer or something like that. You can with a monk, I feel like maybe you could be like a tank or something like that. But it's like you're very melee. You're in melee. You're beating
Well,
guys up. You have your key and stuff like
I
that.
was gonna say you can be kind of like a quasi spellcaster, right? It's basically you're like an Eastern themed, a karate magician, right? And you can place the emphasis on the karate or on the magician, right? So I
Yeah.
will agree it's very limited.
That's a really good way to frame it. Yeah, you can place the emphasis on the karate or the magician. Fuck yeah.
Um,
Um,
I think paladin just might even be a little bit more narrow than that, right? Like you are a champion of like goodness, paladin specifically, like champion is an attempt to broaden this, right? Um, but I think that I think the other thing too is that like because monk is the way to fight unarmed, and that is like a specific fantasy for a lot of people. There there is naturally pressure, and I think developer supported ways and like other supported ways to make it less karate magician and more like you know be the way to fight. Like if you have a concept that's unarmed, you're probably playing monk, and so like the pressure for because that has to hold all of that weight, you get like avenues to peel off of the karate magician kind of thing that usually come in a little bit later, which is maybe why I'm resisting it a little bit. But I think you're largely correct that like the monk has
Yeah, and I think people react strongly to strong class fantasies, right? Because my overall point is people tend to prefer playing paladins than playing fighters in my experience, right? When I think of my friends, which is funny because I'm kind of the opposite. In order for somebody to play a fighter, they typically are bringing a lot of themselves to the table. I like fighters, right?
yeah
They're bringing a lot of themselves to the table. They're bringing a whole kind of thing to slot on top of kind of the game's fantasy. But I think there are a lot of people who want the game to give them the fantasy, right?
right
And who kind of show up and go, oh, what's interesting? And the thing that's interesting is paladin. Paladin is what grabs people because it has such a strong core fantasy to itself. That is I feel like that is sort of what he's getting at a little bit here. Because a wizard can do so much and kind of be so much, I actually do sort of understand why an arcanist ends up kind of like being weirdly more popular, or even sorcerer, right? The reason sorcerer was originally introduced, because it was not included in D&D 3.0, was because they felt like wizard was not connecting with people, and they wanted to give people another way to interface with magic systems that wasn't dealing with spell books and stuff like that, which I thought was really interesting. That's like super old lore though,
yeah
from
no it's
the
weird
2000.
I actually think you're pointing to something interesting because like wizard does have like a specific fantasy that's like aligned with it just like doesn't manifest quite properly in the way that like I think actually like cantrips as like basic units of attack have got a good way to addressing that. I think for like balance reasons maybe it's not the greatest thing, but that's neither here nor there. But like when I think wizard, right, like the thing I think of is like Merlin from the Sword in the Stone animated film,
Yep.
right? Like and it's somebody who studies, it's somebody who is old, right? Typically doesn't have to be, right, but like learns out of books, right? Like this is even Harry Potter, right? Like Harry Potter like learns specific spells out of books. He doesn't remember, but like the thing that doesn't connect is you don't get that kind of fancy and fire and forget spells, right? It's like a spell is a thing you learn, and then you have like maybe you need to practice it and get mastery over it to make it not falter. But like you like the essence of being a wizard is kind of like doing this and being able to be reactive about it, right? Which is not a thing that's like supported super well by the wizard fantasy, right? Like weirdly, I think that like maybe the part of the disconnect is like you want to be able to like play like a kineticist that studies out of a book, even though that doesn't really make sense for like from like a mechanics perspective, right? Like that's like and because like the game term doesn't has a thing associated with it, it kind of like blocks us off, right? Like there is nothing that says that I couldn't play an arcanist, not an arcanist, a kineticist that like studies out of books, right? Like, has a very high arcana score in PF2E lingo, right? Studied at the Magical Academy and like slings these things around, and the way you flavor it is spells, but because he's not called a wizard, it's never going to feel quite right. Right? Like, this is like the old joke about the orc wizard, like, casts punch and he just like punches you in the face, right? Like, you can call it a wizard, but is he really a wizard? Right? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah, now we're getting like, do words mean things?
Yeah.
I think actually, this is sort of like my history things. But that has a lot to do with it, right? I think something that's complicated that people don't necessarily understand is that words are not just definitions, they're also connotations, right? Like the way that the human brain conceives of words is in both the explicit thing that you've been taught that's in a dictionary, but also in the complex web of things that connects to all the other things in the, unlimited map of your brain's ability to comprehend language, right? This is why it's kind of ridiculous. It's paradoxically ridiculous, but also makes a ton of sense when that one Supreme Court justice said, "I just know it when I see it." That's true. That is actually how words work. That's how words work all the time,
Yeah.
right? Because so much of it is not just on definition, but also connotation, right? And I think the connotation of the word wizard is all of this extra stuff that we're talking about, right? Big, long, flowing beard, the floppy hat, right? Intellect based, all of those things are connotations of the word wizard, right? That are kind of like complicated and tougher to sort of parse. But the feeling, and I think this is where the class fantasy of wizard does work, the feeling of having the right spell for the job is amazing. I don't know that I can ever, there are few times I think that a tabletop game pops off in such a way as when a wizard has a way to solve an incredibly complex problem in a Gordian knot way because he has some weird fucking spell prepared that just deals with it, right? I can't even think of a good example off the top of my head. Maybe the thing I was describing a couple of weeks ago, technically I was playing a warlock, not a wizard, but it was sort of this effect where I cast gaseous form on a person who's wearing a cursed item, and the cursed item fell, was disincluded from the gaseous form. The cursed item fell to the ground, right? They're no longer cursed. I got them to put down the item by tricking them and using this spell in a clever way, right? Like, I feel like that's that's a lot of the class fantasy of like a wizard, right? Or really any sort of spellcaster kind of like feels this way, but just having the right spell for the job is sort of the thing. And I think maybe not undo, but extra emphasis gets put on that for wizards because their spell slots are prepared and their utility is so insanely varied.
Yeah. And I think part of it is like, I think part of the issue is like essentially power game versus kind of like verisimilitude is what I'm going to say, right? Like the reason that Merlin works, right, or like the kind of Merlin archetype works in kind of like the core fantasy is that like it's like I need to deal with this specific situation, right? It's like, oh, I know a spell for this, right? And he goes and he ruffles through his things, right? And like maybe he has to go into his tower and like, search through his books and I found it, and like he goes, walks back and like, figures the problem out, right? The problem is that like turning that into a game system means that like the player will be like, it's in my spell book, I get to cast a spell, right? Like, and so like the fantasy that you want is like, the wizard has this power available to him, but he has to go seek it out at like, because like, he won't have like, say, knock, right, at his fingertips, right? But he definitely learned it back in Wizard College, right? And he has it written down somewhere, but he doesn't necessarily have it on him. Because like as a person, right? Like, I've got like I have a miter saw in my garage, right? I don't carry my fucking miter saw with me everywhere, but I can cut. Like if I need to go cut a piece of wood, I go back to my house and I use the miter saw, right? The problem is that like a gamer will like strap the miter saw to his back because it's going to be useful at some point, and he doesn't have to actually be the weirdo fighter walking around town with his miter saw strapped to his back, right? Like the you know like that's like that's where like the fantasy and the practical, like the fantasy in the game kind of like hit a breaking point essentially, right? Like because I like the way this would resolve itself in like a story that you would write about this, right? To continue the meta is like you know I don't have a miter saw on me because it would be weird for me to be carrying my miter saw around me with all the time just in case I need it, right? But the power gamer would be like, well, it doesn't cost me anything in terms of either narrative or mechanics for me to have it on me if I can like hit the weight requirement, right? Um, like the way that you would maybe combat this as a GM is be like, everybody's looking at you weird because you have a fucking miter saw strapped to your back, right? No one wants to talk to the weirdo with the miter saw strapped to his back. But that's like a very soft skills thing that doesn't like systematize well, right? And I think that's part of the problem. Why to address the later part of this post, which is like why you can't bring wizard into necessarily into line with like what the fantasy of a wizard is typically. Does that make sense at all?
So it does, and there's an interesting other piece of this which I do think is neat, which is that I think that system exists for gamers, they just don't ever use it, which is scribing scrolls, right?
Yeah.
I think the thing that gamers are supposed to do is I'm sorry, to back this up. I think if I'm a designer on D&D 3.5, right, the granddaddy of all this stuff, right? I think that's the reason that Scribe Scroll exists, right? And scrolls in general sort of exist, right? If I'm a wizard and I'm at the end of my day and I just like want to do, like I want to find some of these utility spells that I'm using really rarely. I want to find that miter saw and put it in my garage. I don't want to prepare it every day. I'm not going to prepare knock every day, right? But I might, while I'm sitting in camp, scribe a scroll of knock, right? And use my scroll of knock in order to get into this door that is or chest or whatever, like whatever the thing is. And there's a million different ways you can do that. And I think Baldur's Gate is actually probably the best I've ever seen at actually, like fulfilling that kind of fantasy of giving you a bazillion scrolls. And when you're in the moment, you're just like, oh my God, I have a scroll of Featherfall.
Right.
Let's Featherfall down, right? Like that kind of thing. The complicated thing is that scrolls take experience points to scribe.
I don't think that's true in PF2E anymore, but yes, that was
I'm sure. I'm sure it's absolutely not. But I think this is the thing. I think this is the thing that keeps people from scribing scrolls, right? Which is they were using this esoteric crafting rules around spending experience, and I feel like gamers have the instinct that anything that levels or power, anything that would ever cost experience is incorrect, right? Even if you and I would understand the value proposition, it probably not make sense, right? The most diehard min-max gamers out there probably, could say, "Oh, it is better to spend a tiny bit of experience, right, on scribing a couple of scrolls in your downtime than, have the extra 300 experience, even if it means the rest of your party levels up for a session and it takes you a little time to catch up."
I actually think that's the bigger problem. I don't think the problem is necessarily spending the experience. I think the problem is the idea that you will be behind your friends in the level progression.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. I think this is the thing that keeps people from strapping the miters out of there. I think it's that it's the same sort of visceral sort of like the collective unconscious of like an adventuring party that it keeps you from doing that. Like besides the fact that the systems themselves are impossible to parse, right? I don't know how you feel about that. Like old crafting systems.
Oh yeah.
I played so much D&D 3.5 and I crafted in D&D 3.5, right? But the systems for doing so is just like basically incomprehensible or whatever. So there's a certain level of just it's a really complicated system. Nobody wants to delve into it.
They are simultaneously incredibly hard to parse and also incredibly boring, right? Like there's like nothing fun about crafting in these games, which is, you know, a design decision. I'm not saying that's invalid, but it's like, you know, you roll some dice and you make the check or you don't, right? Like in all situations, it's streamlined in PF2E, but that's basically what it is, right? Like,
and I think that it is sort of the failure of that system that has driven players away, I would say, from Vancian Magic. I think I imagine a version of things. Well, let's say 3.5 had a really intuitive system for scribing scrolls. Let's just say at the end of a day, a wizard can take his unused spell slots and scribe a certain number of scrolls. Let's say we balance this in some magical way, because I can't think of how that would be balanced. It'd be so broken if you know, on its face. And you know, you just tuck those scrolls away, keep them in the backpack for later, kind of thing, and like move on with your like adventuring day. I think that is probably a system where we don't see a sort of turn away from Vancian magic. We see a turn towards it over time, and D&D 5e inherits some version of this system that makes more sense. Instead, I think the opposite has happened, which is that this sort of extra piece has kind of atrophied because nobody wants to deal with scribing scrolls and this kind of stuff. Scrolls are really just loot. You know, there's a system for creating them, I guess, maybe, who cares, kind of thing. No one is ever going to get involved in that sort of thing. And we all sort of move on.
Yeah, so it's interesting because like I think part of the problem here too is that like there are variables that you can't hold consistent across different types of games, right? Like I think, and on top of the experience thing, even like the gold thing, there is, I think, a relatively hard bias against buying consumables, right? Like maybe health potions if you absolutely have to. There's also but like you can't know, like in terms of like designing the system, you can't know how much time any given party is going to have, right? Like, you know, if I'm playing a game where it's like, you know, you do some stuff and then there's like downtime in between, like, you know, your sense of adventures, right? Like, does you know, Melvin the Wizard just like spend 3 weeks just like constantly scribing scrolls? Is that going to cause a problem, right? Like a balance problem? Like even if like, you know, you abstract away out the gold problem, right? Like maybe the answer there is that like you can't actually hand away the gold problem, and that if you keep the gold relatively consistent, and you don't let him like work during that time, like it'll balance itself out in the end. But I think these are part of the problems, like making that system work, right? Like you can't, if you were playing like a pure dungeon crawl, right, you can't scribe scrolls probably during that process. And I guess maybe the answer is just like balancing around that, but like also maybe encouraging players to like do things with their downtime, right? Which is I think is like a GMing skill thing, right? It's like
yeah, there's a piece of this in Michael Sayre's second thread that I thought was pretty interesting, where he talks about kind of like the adventuring day, and how they design their idea for an adventuring day is 3 encounters. He says 3 encounters is basically the assumed baseline, which is why 3 is the default number of spells per level that core casters cap out at. You're generally assumed to be having about 3 encounters per day and using 1 top rank slot per encounter, supplemented by some combination of cantrips, focus spells, you know, consumables, limited use consumables, that kind of thing. Which is pretty interesting to me. Like, it's I had this thing where I was eventually, when it came to Hell's Rebels, because we were playing for 3 hours on a weeknight, I felt like we could only do 1 combat, right? Like 1 encounter, right? So I was sort of designing every encounter to go balls to the wall with you guys, right? Because generally by the next session, I would say you guys long rested, right? Is that 3, you know, encounters per day, like a baseline that you agree with?
If you go a couple posts down, Mark Seifter chimes in, and he gives a little bit more flavor there. It's not 3 encounters per day total, but is balanced around the definitions of moderate, severe, and extreme encounters found in the CRB. It's unlikely for an average group to take many more than 3 moderate plus encounters in a day. So I mean the thing, the problem that we're talking about here is like, you know, the standard kind of like 4-hour adventuring day problem, right? And I kind of get that, and I think it makes sense, right? Like you can like push around the edges of that. Um, and I think the solution there has to be like, you know, dungeon master enforced for similitude, right? Like if like you say you don't long rest a lot in Baldur's Gate 3 because it feels bad, right?
Yeah.
Like that's basically what you have to do, I think, at the tabletop, right? Like is like make it feel weird to like, go to the dungeon and come back and take a nap, right? Like, um because you need to like build enough of like a real world in order for that to work. And I think that's funnily enough, weirdly enough, I think that's like just the solution, right? Is that
Yeah,
yeah.
that's fair. When we were doing dungeons, even in Hell's Rebels, we did those on Saturdays where they could go much longer. That's a bazillion encounters, right? A dungeon is
Yeah.
like 10 encounters. But I also think that Pathfinder adventure paths always have a contingency, which is that like if the players start a dungeon and then long rest in the middle of the dungeon, bad stuff happens. Typically, monsters come back. You have to redo some encounters, or future encounters that they didn't get more difficult, right? So if they enter the dungeon and they're gonna go fight the bad guy, but then they leave and rest and come back to finish the dungeon, the bad guy has now buffed himself a whole bunch and he's much harder to deal with, like that kind of thing. Which I also quite like that system, right? That's a lot of how I like to think about like adventuring in dungeons and all that sort of thing. I also think that it's a different sort of skill set, right? One of the things that I like about doing a dungeon is the encounter to encounter, I might need this later calculus. I think
Right.
that's really fun, and it's one of the places where D&D system kind of comes alive. When you're doing sort of one encounter days, which is sort of the other piece of that Hell's Rebel thing I was talking about, basically everybody just kind of came out the gate blasting. It's a little of like in World of Warcraft when you lust on pull and
Yeah.
you just absolutely blow up these boss fights, right? You kind of have to, that's a thing you have to like balance around and deal with and all of that other kind of all of that other kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean,
You had this thing about cantrips that I wanted to follow up on, but you can finish your thought
no,
real quick.
go for it.
You had this thing around cantrips. What is your deal with cantrips?
Just that, like, I am not sure, like, the part of maybe the fundamental fantasy around, right, like what a wizard should be is like a thing that like grows in power over time, and also like has like high highs but low lows, right? Like kind of like this typical 3/5 wizard, right? Like had like one or two, kind of like well-timed game changer spells, right? Early
Sure.
on. And then was stuck the rest of the day plinking away with a crossbow, essentially, right? Like, or maybe mixing it up with a quarterstaff if you were really daring. Um, and basically, like cantrips get rid of all of that, which I think is good on the one hand, but like also kind of like means that you kind of have to shave some of the power off of the spells on the other, because essentially you are a force to be reckoned with at all times, right? Like you have a moderate damage dealing ability, which,
Okay.
which is, I think, like this is kind of like the very old discussion of what is it, linear fighters, quadratic wizards, quadratic casters, which is like an old thing, which is like back in 3.5, the like a basically like wizard and fighter kind of like cross at power levels around level 7, and then past, like before that fighters are more powerful, and past that wizards are more powerful. There's a couple mitigating factors here, right? Like wizards in like AD&D had like as a matter of progression got like fortresses and like soldiers to command, um because that was still like basically when it was still like primarily an inherited out of war games. um and the other side of this too is like maybe that was and this is the thing I'm highlighting, right, is that like maybe it's okay for that to be true because the wizards kind of have to struggle through those early levels where they're not right, and like the spells do very cool, very powerful things, um but as the trade-off on your like on like most turns, you're kind of like not being the most effective. So um I don't have a hard opinion on that, but like it's just the thing I think about sometimes. I don't know where it comes down on it.
That's actually pretty interesting. I think part of it is that cantrips aren't built to have most cantrips don't have flat bonuses, right? They're all just dice basically. I guess like
But they scale.
warlocks it can Right. So yeah, but so what I mean is they scale at the same rate that like a fighter would get extra attacks, but an extra attack is way more valuable to a fighter than an extra D8 on Ray of Frost is to a wizard. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, maybe.
If I'm a fighter
Yeah.
with a greatsword getting to attack twice for 2d6 damage, plus my strength mod and all
Yeah,
this
yeah.
other sort of stuff, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's just gonna like put out way more damage than my Ray of Frost. So I definitely think the low lows are there and the high highs are there. But to me, it's interesting because whenever I think of the difference between fighters and wizards, my thing with fighters and wizards is that wizards have complex targeting, fighters have much simpler targeting, right? Generally, a fighter is only ever going after AC, right? In terms of defenses, right?
Right.
A fighter is very rarely dealing with saving throws. It's very rarely dealing with kind of extraneous sort of systems for that. But what a wizard has access to, and this is the thing that makes them so powerful, in my opinion, when it comes to dealing stuff to opponents, is that a wizard can look at a creature and go, I bet that thing has a dog shit dexterity save. I'm going to cast lightning bolt and blow it up, right? Or it'll look at a group and say, oh, that thing that probably has a really good dexterity save. I'm going to cast hold person, right? Or something like that, right? In order to like lock it down. And because it can always and this is part of what I think he's talking about, Michael Sayre is talking about, or Sayre is talking about when he's talking about power with min-maxers with wizards, is their ability to specifically target the weakest defenses of individual opponents on any individual day, right? It is incorrect for a wizard to prepare 4 fireballs in their third level spell slot, because really what they want to do is they want to prepare fireball, for things that are going to be weak to dex. They want to prepare, I don't know, whatever, like vampiric touch or
I
something.
was
It's just like a bunch
saying
of different things.
fireball for things in a radius, lightning bolt for things in a line, and like
Yeah, exactly, right. And a million other things, because it's not just
Yeah.
that. Sometimes it's touch AC, right?
Yeah.
There are some creatures that have a really low touch AC, some creatures that have a much higher touch AC.
Is touch AC a thing in 5e? Because it hasn't been a thing in Pathfinder 2e.
Yeah, that's true. I'm thinking in terms of Pathfinder 1e,
1e
but
and 3.5.
yeah, I guess it's not. Is it a thing in 5e? I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Yeah.
But yes,
But and so anyway, a fighter is always going against AC, basically, right? The way a fighter deals damage is they go in and they do AC, basically. And so that's what I feel like was I don't know, like underwriting some of that sort of stuff. And I definitely do feel that in Baldur's Gate in a lot of ways, because I feel like when my party we've done this, like part of my long resting thing is I'm a rogue, right? We carry Karlach a lot of the time, we carry Late Cell a lot of the time, and it's just like they're just good for it. They can just do this forever, right? Because they're just mostly built on the engine of just raw attacks. Get in range, get to land your attacks, go nuts, right? That's me, right? I want to, if I can hit my sneak attack every turn, I'm doing max damage basically, right? It's not like I need a lot of short rest or long rest or per day stuff in order to make that work. But in order for Gale to be really worth it in my party, he's got to be casting some buku spells, right? And I feel like that's kind of what is,
yeah,
I don't know, like underwriting on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair.
What do you think warlocks come down? I mentioned warlocks. Now I'm interested in your opinion, just as a 5e player who has played warlocks. Like, where do you think they come down in all this?
So warlocks have a very strong class fantasy, right? Like, so much so that in fact that like I think like most of like the packs just kind of like the Fey Pact and like the Celestial Pact feel kind of weird. I think it's like from like a class fantasy perspective.
Like you have to take the Infernal Pact.
Not have to, just like like I think Infernal, I think Old One works, right? Like I think
Sure,
Fey makes sense. It just like doesn't like if it feels like what Warlock should be is like Pact Bound Caster, and Warlock is the Infernal one, right? And Fey bound is, you know, like there's not been
like
worse.
there is a subclass. There's the divine subclass for it, right? Which is sort of like the Oracle was in Pathfinder, but they don't call it that. It's like celestial, like
It's a celestial
passive the
pact.
celestial, and it makes you a healer, right? It gives you a bunch of healing shit.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting design, you know, in 5e, but it's very weird to call that a warlock.
Yeah, yeah. You might call it like an anointed one, right? Like, or something like that, right? Like, you know, like you want those like champion names for the non, you know, infernal warlock, right? Like but beyond that, like I think they kind of feel like they feel it's I do not play it the way it's supposed to be played. Like I don't use Eldritch Blast. I don't even know Eldritch Blast. But it's
Oh,
supposed
really?
yeah. I like to play a lot of kind of like a combination fighter casters, so I like hit things with my hammer. I'm a dwarf, and so I have proficiency.
But you have like Pact of the Blade or whatever, so you
no, actually, because we didn't need that. I've packed up the tome. I just hit things with my hammer anyway, and I probably shouldn't.
Just like intentionally making it as hard as you possibly can.
So to be fair, I end up casting spells, and I also like I hit with Green Flame Blade, which is like a cantrip that attaches. It's like essentially kind of like doing shocking grasp in BG3.
Okay.
So it's just kind of like I just mix it up a little bit more. Even though I'm like more statted out to be like a pure caster. I would probably do slightly better if I was using Eldritch Blast, but you know, I just like this better thematically.
Yeah, because in a certain sense, I think Warlock has a really interesting sort of spellcaster design because you get extremely limited spells, right? You get a spell known list, and then you get a certain number of spells, but the spells are per rest, right?
Per short
rest. Yeah. Which is really interesting. And then on top of that, you get spells per short rest, and then and your spells are always at the highest level possible, right?
Yes, you get two for most of the game. You get 2 spells for short rest, and then eventually you get 3, and then you also get like that's up to 5th. That's not highest level possible. It's highest level you can cast up to 5th, because after 5th you basically get like 1 a day spells in the
for 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah.
Okay. That tracks, because that's also like the other classes you can't interact. Like for instance, there's like the arcane points or whatever that you get as a wizard. There's also the nature points you get as a druid, where you can refresh your own spell slots or whatever. And like you could refresh 5 level 1 spell slots if you wanted, or the kind of thing. But you can't refresh a level 6 spell slot. Once you cast your level 6 spell, you're done. So
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, no, that tracks to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like warlocks are also, I definitely think warlocks have a really strong class fantasy. I think every D&D 5e game I've ever heard about or played in has included a warlock, because people just like love it so much.
Well, so it's also got a lot of like, it comes with a built-in role-playing hook, right? Like, which is like a thing that like even the other ones with super hardcore class fantasies don't necessarily have a built-in role-playing hook, right?
Yeah.
Like at some point your warlock will deal with his pact, right? Like, and it will be like some aspect of the story, right? Like it has to be, right? Like, I mean,
it's kind of like the obligations from Star Wars. What a great system that was.
Yeah. Yes. No, you're right. It is a built-in obligation, right? Like, and you can build around these things. Like you can write them into your character's backstory or develop them over the course of play. But like nothing is quite as built in as the warlock. Plus, it's also like the blaster class, right? Like, if you want,
being able to Eldritch Blast, just zam zam every turn.
Yeah, I mean, it is missing some of like kind of like the elementalist vibe that like, as I think another part of the core, that kind of like core magic user blaster fantasy, but it's close enough, right, for most people. And you can like do all sorts of weird shit with your Eldritch Blast, if you want to. That actually, thinking about it, like the warlock might actually come closest to kind of hitting what you want from like that wizard fantasy. Now that I think about it, right? Because you can kind of like do wizard shit, but you could do blasty shit most of the time, and every once in a while you get to do like your special thing, right? Which I think makes sense. But it's called warlock, and it comes with baggage, so a little bit different.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, we're just about in an hour. So, do you have anything else you want to talk about with this?
No, I'm good. Do you have any more that you want to do?
Not on this wizard stuff.
Okay.
How was your week?
What did I do this week? I played a lot of Baldur's Gate, to be honest. We have been in that clipping things off period of Baldur's Gate. And it's been going pretty good. We're just getting rid of quests from the quest inventory, like the quest log. And there's some great stuff in this back half that we've been like plugging away at. But there's also some stuff that's like a fucking slog. There is one like collectathon quest in the third act of Baldur's Gate that is intensely frustrating.
I have just hit Act 3 in Baldur's Gate.
Nice.
And I promptly was like, I need to take a break from this. Just because like there's so much dumb stuff to do, right? Like so many like it's like you beat it, right? Yeah, yay! And then you need to go like talk to 72 people and walk somewhere, and then and then the intercalary thing happens, which spoiler warning for Baldur's Gate 3. You get attacked by Githyanki.
Oh my god, that happened. Wait, I'm sorry. Wait.
In like the astral plane is what I'm talking about.
Right. That's also happened. Did you get attacked by the Githyanki at the bridge?
The bridge? Which bridge?
Okay. I don't know. Maybe this is something that I unlocked that you didn't necessarily unlock. There's when you're going to Baldur's Gate, there's like a bridge or whatever.
I have not gotten to Baldur's Gate yet. I am in like Rivington.
Oh, okay. But so you didn't do the creche, right?
No, I didn't.
You skipped the creche? Right. Okay. This is why. There is a thing at the end of the creche where you get like marked by like the Githyanki where they want to kill you guys, right? They know you have this mind flayer parasite trying to kill you or whatever. So they're sending like goon squads after you essentially. And one of those goon squads attacks on this bridge. You are walking and there's a bridge over top of you. And under the bridge, is the thing to Baldur's Gate. So right as you're gonna go click the thing to go to Baldur's Gate, you get attacked by a bunch of Githyanki, which is pretty funny. Especially because when we originally triggered that, it was because I think Rachel had like an earth elemental out. We'd used this earth elemental for like all of this whole dungeon. Or no, actually, this is even before then. We had been just snooping around that area, and I accidentally got onto the bridge while hiding, and I spawned the Githyanki, but they were all looking away from me, so I just backed up slowly. And then we later came back and did a whole thing. We ambushed them, that kind of thing. But it's very funny. But yeah, the Astral Githyanki is also a thing.
Yeah, no, that was like one of those times where it's like, am I supposed to be like, this guy is clearly torturing this Githyanki, right? Like the prince, which has like bigger implications. Like, should I say, like, I said like no to him the first time, and then like the fight was just like, I was just like so unprepared for the fight that like that like it killed me. And I was like, I don't care, I'm going to Google this. Is like, if you say no and you kill him, you will lose the game, right?
Yeah, so that is what we did. We said no both times, and we did kill him. We actually put all of our stuff. We were just like, I bet if we kill him, we just get out of the fight. And then it goes, nope, you still got to do the fight. And now he's at 1 HP. It's just like, fuck, god damn it.
Yeah, no, it was that was kind of a slog. Just kind of like, because I was like I was like, oh, I'll get to Act 3 and then I'll stop for the night. It's just like, I have to deal with whatever the fuck this is, right? Like, and I didn't think it was particularly good. So like I like just kind of like, I didn't call that specific twist, but I'm like, there's a reason why he keeps telling you to like eat more parasites or whatever, right?
Yeah,
like,
slurp up tadpoles. Yep.
Yeah. No, I'm not gonna fucking do that. So like, drop the other boot already, you fucking Baz, right? Like,
Yeah, complicated. I don't know. We'll see how the game ends. Honestly, we're barreling closer towards it. I don't know. Maybe by the end of this week we'll clip it off. The other thing that I did was Starfield. So how much Starfield did you end up?
I have not played since we last talked. Just
Okay, I played I have had the hardest time getting in Starfield. I talked about this on the cast. I was just like, man, this like game is just not connecting for me or whatever. There was some stuff. I did one quest that was pretty fun. The first quest at the UC Vanguard is really great. I won't spoil that. But it's lore. Like I think part of what is getting me about Starfield is the lack of lore. Because it's a brand new world, like universe or whatever, there's just like a lot of lore that it needs to introduce you to. And I think it's doing a pretty bad job of introducing me to that. I'm thinking about like when I first played Mass Effect, when you go to the Citadel Presidium, you do the introductory quest, which has a great hook, by the way. There's this guy, he's a Spectre. You're learning to become a Spectre. He gets iced on his first fucking mission. And then you go to the Citadel and you're locked down in the Citadel. And you have to go through this like talking, do all this like talking and stuff. That was such an amazing thing in 2007, right? It was so cool. It was the greatest shit in the world, right? But I think the thing that really made that experience so transcendent and would later catapult sort of this Mass Effect property as far as it ended up going, or continues to go, because I guess they're still working on another one, was you could just sit down and talk to the computer about the lore of the world, and it would just explain the lore of the world to you, right? It was like, yep, there was this war, the humanity, the first contact war. Eventually the humans, made peace or whatever. Everybody decided it was a big misunderstanding. These are the different races. This is what their politics are like, all of this other sort of stuff. And it really just like submerged you in that sort of feeling. I think that Skyrim did a pretty good job of that too. All the run up all the way doing all that Whiterun stuff. When you're going to Whiterun and then the dragon attacks and stuff, it's like that stuff is all great. You meet this Jarl, you learn that the Jarl being, courted to, there's a rebellion, there's the Stormcloaks and the Imperials or whatever, all this other sort of stuff, right? Starfield, it just didn't capture me on any of those sorts of like levels. It did get me though, just by this thing that only a Bethesda game could really do, which was when you're flying around star systems, I was getting scanned for contraband. Okay. Like you go to New Atlantis and they scan you for contraband. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Let's see where this goes. What's next here, basically. And then I found some contraband. I teleported to a system. System had a space station. I went into the space station. I cleared it out. I found a bunch of contraband in the bottom. Oh, interesting. This is marked as contraband. And I was like, well, if I bring the contraband to a system and I get scanned, are they going to find it? And the answer is yeah. So I put the contraband in my ship. I flew to the system. They scanned me for contraband. They found the contraband. I save scummed. I reloaded the quick save, basically. I think I probably would have had to like pay a fine or something. I didn't even stick around. I just wanted to see how the scans work. But I was like, okay, well, if there's scanning, there's gotta be smuggling, obviously. So I eventually found a quest that led me to the pirates of the Crimson Fleet. And I was like, oh, I bet the pirates have deal with this stuff, right? You do the pirates quest. The pirates quest is actually pretty cool and pretty fun. There's like a lot going on in that quest, and it has been the most engaging set of quests I've done so far. But when they show you their secret pirate space station, which is pretty quick to be fair, when they show you their secret pirate space station, you go to their secret pirate space station, and they have an unregistered ship technician. Okay, that's interesting. I wonder what's there. And then I look and I start getting into the shipbuilding mechanics, and I'm like, oh, this is the whole thing. And she sells shielded cargo containers, which are cargo containers that will block scans, right? As well as scan jammers, right? which are just like little discs, and you can affix them anywhere on your ship that you kind of have open little nodes, because the shipbuilding is all about these little like docking nodes. Can you dock this onto this? Can you dock a weapon onto that, like that slot? And I was like, oh, okay, here we go. Now we're cooking with gas. And then I went and I did more shit, and I found a bunch more contraband, and I went and I put it where I found my first contraband. And I was like, okay, here's my fucking contraband stash. We're gonna smuggle. We're gonna be smugglers now. And then I went and I upgraded my shit. I put on a bunch of scan jammers or whatever. I went and I got my contraband. I flew through one of the settled systems. I got scanned. I had a 66% chance of evading the scan, and then woof, passed the check. Hell yeah. And I was like, okay, you got me, Starfield. I'm fucking in it. That was like 7 hours. Like that was just like my Sunday was just figuring out how to smuggle this contraband that I had found in order to make a big ass payday, which I did in fact make, and which was in fact very cool. And so now I feel like I'm in it. Now I feel like Starfield has gotten me, because it has it has hit me with this like fantasy of being an intergalactic smuggler. I am playing, funnily enough, did I tell you this? I'm playing Mateo Vasquez.
Ah, you did not.
Yeah, that is, a lot of the time when I play like one of these RPGs, like character like Condor Tonric, something like that. But I decided, I was like, what's a good character for this? I was like, oh, Mateo Vasquez. And then I learned that one of the main guys in Constellation is fucking named Mateo. And I was like, when does that ever happen? Like, when does that ever happen?
I went with like a very sci-fi name. My character is named Braxton Borealis.
It's like what was the Jad Fandu?
Yeah, Jad
what a
Fandu.
great Star Wars name. Yeah.
Well, I spend time on my names just because like I like when the names fit the characters. Like I have a kobold swashbuckler who's like the son of like an Osiran merchant in a PF2E game. And he's like Geniekin vaguely, and his name is Suleiman Augustus Pendraco III. And it's just kind of like, you want that kind of like flavor with like, kind of like, it's like, oh, he's kind of like, a dick, he's a little bit full of himself because he like uses his full fucking name, right? Like, it's.
No, I understand. Yeah, this is like a definition connotation, right? Like names have connotations. Like if I asked you to imagine a man named Walter, you probably have a certain subset of things in your brain, older, white, right? Probably, like 50s or 60s, right? But if I were to ask you to imagine a woman, or maybe keep it a man. If I were to ask you to imagine a man named Ricky, you probably have a different, like thing, trucker hat, trailer trash, right? Like a bunch of these is like connotation stuff like that. And I feel like finding a good name with good connotations is like real. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean that's also like has a bunch of, funnily enough, my uncle is named Rick. And so I don't have that specific combination, but like I'm thinking about it, right? Like
my father-in-law is named Rick, right? But there's a big difference between my father-in-law who goes by Rick and like, my former coworker who is Richard, right?
Yeah, or like the difference between Bob and Robert, right? Like
yeah, Bobby or Robert, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, Mateo is also who I am playing in my 5e sandbox swashbuckler, or not swashbuckler, but 5e sandbox seafaring game. We're calling it the seafaring game. Rachel, who's DMing this game, insists that it is not a pirate game, even though we kept calling it the pirate game. She's like, you guys don't have to be pirates, which is good because Mateo is not a pirate. Mateo, in like part of his like character fantasy, is that he is a smuggler. Okay, he thinks of himself, he is better than.
Are you trying to bait me into replaying fucking Ralph?
If you want to, the lore is sweet. The lore in Rachel's 5e game is really sweet. There's like there's like a big kingdom on the kind of the bottom of the map, and there's like a big archipelago, right? But in the northeast edge of the map is this place called the Wild Seas. Okay, and the Wild Seas is where like all the Leviathan are, right? And there's a specific for the race, for the campaign race called the Onean, who are fish people that live at like the bottom of the sea, but they are Leviathan hunting fish people, and they ride big fish that are super fast, right? And that's how they like dodge their leviathans, right? And leviathan hunting is a real profession. You go out, you kill yourself a leviathan, you bring a bunch of stuff back, right? Like one of the questions I asked when we were doing this, when we were doing like the session 0 for this, I was like, what's the most famous ship of all time or something like that? And she was like, oh, well, there's one famous pirate ship which covered its hull in certain sea serpent scales so that it would deflect cannon fire, right? Like that kind of thing. And I was just like, oh yes, this is so great and so perfect. But yeah, Mateo is the son of a pirate king. But he oh my god, Orion, please. He's the son of a pirate king, but he thinks pirates are brutes, right? They are uncultured, right? The true way to be a criminal is to have finesse, okay, and precision and panache. So he is a mastermind. He's going to be a mastermind rogue, and I'm very excited to get up to shenanigans.
Very cool. That is pretty cool.
Yeah, the characters for this game are all pretty sweet. Warren is going to be playing, I think, a Path of the Deeps barbarian, which I never heard of, but it's from like the League of Legends, supplement that they made. Which I was describing, I think, to you maybe on the cast a couple of weeks ago. And then there's also a warlock, like unearthed arcana, like warlock pack called Pact of the Kraken, where you get your, you essentially like make a pact with like a super powerful sea beast, right? Like Cthulhu or whatever. And my friend Mart is playing a Pact of the Kraken warlock, who is
Yeah, I was gonna say like the old one, like there's a chthonic pact, like there's like an old one's pact that's like core, but that makes sense.
It is not Pact of the Old Ones is very like you get telepathy and stuff like that, right? This one is very sea based, right? It's like you get I actually, honestly, you would also find this very funny. One of the pact boons is a or not pact, I don't know what they're called, just like one of the things you get for being this pact is an ink defense, which is if somebody attacks you with a melee attack, you can squirt ink everywhere. And I was like, are you gonna be whenever you do this and you run away, please make sure you make the Zoidberg sound, okay? But yeah, it's like the pact stuff you can summon like tentacles or something like that, that do stuff. You get this ink defense, which it's cooler than an ink defense. I'm sort of like shitting on it a little bit, but like I actually think it's like you essentially cast darkness, but the idea is that you are squirting a bunch of ink or whatever. There's a bunch of other stuff in there.
Very cool. Yeah. That's awesome. I am kind of jealous. I wish I had the time to play. Yeah. What else for weeks? Something I wanted to talk about last week.
Sure.
Hold on. Somebody in the chat has decided to spam our chat with how do I ban this person? We are going to report for bots. Sorry. Sorry. I want to get this person out of our chat because it bothers me. And ban. Anyway. I would say in WoW I've been doing the Secrets of Azeroth stuff.
Sure.
Which has been super fun. I think we can maybe even do a whole episode on this, but like there's like 3 levels of this. There's like the quests in the game, then there's like the community puzzle where it's like they post on social media somewhere an image of something, you have to go figure out where it is. And then there's this like third thing, which is like a mount that you get for like doing things with people. But none of it's explicit in game. And I love the stuff that's like explicitly in game, but I hate all of the like community stuff. I just look up the solutions and go do them.
Oh, I understand. Yeah, the community stuff is like an ARG, right? Yeah. I understand. That is for the WoW secret finding Discord is a big community.
Sure.
there's like a whole side of WoW that's like built for this stuff. I don't actually know. Did they get anything out of Shadowlands? Were there any big secrets that happened in Shadowlands? I wonder.
I don't know.
In Battle for Azeroth, there was the Hive Mind mount, and then I think in Legion there was one mount that was like part of like the community finding, and like it's just like crazy shit that the community has to go through and figure out on their own, kind of thing. That's interesting. But yeah, I don't think that's not the kind of puzzle that an individual person is meant to do on their own. That's the kind of puzzle that
like a group does together.
Yeah, like a big group all they all do together.
That makes sense. No, I mean, but like the thing, I guess the thing that like really rubbed me is like the community mount thing makes a little bit more like that makes a little bit more sense to me. But these ones that were like, somebody tweets like "Great day in Eastern Plaguelands" and like a screenshot, it's like, and then you got to go find that. It's like I don't care enough to like figure that out myself, but I do care enough to like figure out like because like the quests for Secrets for Azeroth aren't like quests, right? They don't give you a marker. They're like, like yesterday was, it's like some cryptic stuff about Karazhan rather, and it's like, and then it gives you a coordinates, which is like based on one of the earlier quests. You get this helmet that like gives you like coordinates from a reference point. It's like I understand that. I maybe look up exactly where like Karazhan is because I don't remember, right, like that kind of thing. But I go and I do the puzzle, and I find it very satisfying to actually go do the puzzle myself. Whereas like the community note stuff, I just don't, right? Like it's like I will go like look on Wowhead and figure out like and put in the waypoint and fly there. But I do think the Secrets of Azeroth thing is fun to do on my own. So I've been enjoying that a lot. You said you haven't done any of that yet, right?
Yeah, I want to do it before Wednesday because it goes away on Wednesday. Or I'm sorry, not it goes away. There is a feat of strength tied to it that goes away on Wednesday, and I want to make sure that I nab that before the end. So
that makes sense. Is it Wednesday morning at reset time, or is it
I don't know.
Okay.
I think technically it goes away on Thursday.
Okay.
Goes through Wednesday because it started on Labor Day, if I remember correctly. So it's just the first 2 weeks. So on the 14th is probably when it's gone. Hold on, let me look it up now because I don't want to give out
bad information. Yeah, no.
Azeroth feat of until Wednesday, September 13th, 2 p.m. Pacific. Woof.
Which is reset. Yeah. Okay.
Which means we have to do it tomorrow, basically, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't know if the jump jets go away at that point, but like like I've done all of them except for today's and I guess tomorrow's, right? As it's been going along, just because it's been fun. I missed a couple of days and I had to like catch up on it, but like that's no big deal. But like, I think it's a fun and interesting thing to do. And trying to just kind of like, figure things out on your own for the most part.
Okay.
Yeah. What else have I done with my week? I have started re-listening to The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett. I think I'm going to go do all those books over the next bit just because they're funny and they're fun. And I was
going to ask how Highlander is going, or not Outlander is
Outlander.
Going?
I have that's the show I watched with my girlfriend, and we just haven't had the opportunity to watch a bunch of stuff. She was not that any of you need these details, but she was in between jobs, so she spent a bunch of time with me up north. She lives in the city, and so we had a lot of time to like watch stuff. And so now that Outlander season 5 is done for us, we're going to be doing a show of my choice, and I've chosen The Sopranos.
Okay, hell yeah. I've also been watching The Sopranos recently, so we maybe even talk about it on the podcast. Yeah. Imagine that.
Yeah. And so we'll watch season 1 of The Sopranos, and then we'll watch season 6 of Outlander.
Yeah, The Sopranos has been the big show that Sopranos has been the big show that I've been watching. And I want to say that I've been watching a bunch of like other stuff, but the reality is I kind of haven't been. A lot of my time gets eaten up by YouTube these days, just
Me
because
too.
like I don't know. At some point, I want to say last year, I got really into I guess watching VODs from the streamer Destiny, but like because those VODs, it's like 2 hours of content every day. It's just infinite content, as much as I could ever fucking want. Which is on one hand kind of great because I feel like for a long time I was always really like addicted to content in the sense that like there was just like never enough and I was going back and rewatching videos because it just like wasn't coming out fast enough. But now I'm finally in a position where it's just like I can't watch everything. This guy streams 12 hours a day and then cuts that into a 3-hour video, and then puts up another hour video on his fucking channel. I'm not gonna watch 4, like it's ridiculous, right? The other thing that I got really into, have I told you about Sean Munger?
No.
Okay, so
Is Sean
we
Munger
talked about
related
my
to
story.
Mike Munger, the
I have no idea.
economist for U Chicago?
Maybe. Sean Munger is a YouTube he's a historian, right? Who makes YouTube videos. And he makes really long drawn out historical videos on uh
I see he's written a book
just
called Zombies of Byzantium.
he just does these really like big historical sort of like deep dives or whatever. And since part of my thing is I am just like going and getting the details on these things because like of how much I feel like the game of sort of telephone communication tends to like kind of corrupt stuff. I want to get to the heart of it. And at one point I was seeing JFK conspiracy stuff with Lee Harvey Oswald. You know what it was? It was somebody on fucking Twitter. Shoe on Head, obviously.
Yeah.
It was Shoe on Head on Twitter said, I understand distrusting government because of stuff like JFK, which they definitely did. But you at a certain point, essentially you have to trust institutions. So this was sort of her point, which I do agree with that point. I think that this is a big problem in sort of like
Clarify
modern
exactly what point you agree with.
Oh, I'm sorry. The point I think it is important to trust institutions, right? Part of the complicated nature of the modern world is that we have to outsource a lot of trust onto the various pieces of the world around us, right? Our world is global. Globalization has happened, it has occurred, right? Which means there's a lot of things that I just need to trust. I need to trust, for instance, that the CDC is, recommending the correct vaccine, whatever, right? I need to trust that when Pfizer makes this mRNA vaccine, it is going to, dampen the effects if I do catch COVID, right? I need to trust a million, and that's just like the high ticket stuff. There's like a million little things, right? I need to trust that when I press the power button on my phone, it turns on, right? When I download an APK, for an app from the App Store, that it works, right?
This
Like
is
there's
like I pencil stuff, right? Like, no one can like make a pencil from scratch right now, right?
Correct. Yes, correct. Exactly. And so all of this requires a lot of trust in a lot of institutions. There's a lot of people who don't have that trust. These people are conspiracy theorists and they're fucking morons. Okay. Anyway, so Shoe on Head wrote this stupid tweet about how you need to trust institutions, but also that JFK there was some conspiracy to kill JFK. And I was just like, you know what? I don't know enough to explain why she's wrong. Like I can intuit
This is like this is the kind of thing where it's like never have an argument with a conspiracy theorist because they will know a lot of things that you just kind of implicitly trust that you won't be able to
like refute in the moment, right?
yes, exactly that. Yes. Like I know I spent at some point some time learning some basic rebuttals to Holocaust denial arguments.
Oh yeah,
right.
Mm-hmm.
And they exist there, but like this is one of those things where it's like I could because learning how to refute them involves like learning the arguments the first place. I could spit a bunch of stuff at you that you probably wouldn't be able to refute that would make it would cast doubt on it. But the answer is there's like a lot of there's reason. There are explanations that that make the nihilists wrong. It's just kind of like, you probably don't know them because you've never stopped and thought about like the mechanics of committing the Holocaust, right? Like,
yeah, and like the intuition is such a powerful force, right? This is the thing. This is the problem with the JFK assassination. Intuitively, it seems like there's so much more there, right? You have a guy who nobody heard anything out of, completely unrelated. Like his name is Lee Harvey Oswald. He has a job at the book depository, and he has a job at the book depository, and he just decides he's going to assassinate the president. Brings a rifle to the 6th floor of it, shoots the president in the fucking head, right? And then gets captured by the FBI, is interrogated for hours and hours on end with no record of like there's no like tape or anything of that, right? And then he walks out of that room in a routine prisoner transfer between the FBI and to jail. He gets shot dead by a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. And it's just like how on its face, make that make sense, right? Your intuition is constantly trying so hard in order to do that, which is where people come into the conspiracy theories, right? But the more you learn about this whole set of events, the more sense it makes in the most dumb, mundane ways, right? For instance, one of the things Sean Munger says is if you look at assassins in history, assassins are almost always lone wolf killers, right? Outside of John Wilkes Booth, right, who was in a small criminal conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln, and that is truly a small conspiracy, as in a handful of people who all conspired to do this thing, and it didn't work out even close to sort of how they planned. This was not like a big, the kind of conspiracy that's alleged for JFK is that literally Lyndon B. Johnson coordinated this with the CIA because of the Bay of Pigs, right? This is sort of like the level of stuff that people are going after or whatever. But every other presidential assassination has been a lone wolf, right? Or attempted assassination has been a lone wolf.
The most recent successful presidential assassination of President Abe of Japan was a lone wolf with a homemade gun, right? Like, it's one of those, and part of this is also like backwards looking stuff too, right? Like, JFK kind of ended the assassination of JFK kind of like caused that type of thing to be harder to do right now, right? Like, because people care about it more. And to your lone wolf point, you can't intercept communications that don't happen, right? Like, and that's part of it. Also, the thing I always like to talk about is like the closest thing to a real JFK conspiracy theory is that the Russians were afraid that they were going to get blamed for this because Lee Harvey Oswald was an avowed communist that had defected back and forth from the USSR, right? And as a result, they spread some of the conspiracy theories to kind of like, to kind of distract from the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was an avowed communist that had defected to the USSR previously, right? Like, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and so in the same quest that I have for like, I don't know, like World War II stuff or, like this Civil War stuff, I went on that whole Civil War rant like a week or two ago, right? About how, people, the lost cause, all this other sort of stuff. I wanted to get to the bottom of Lee Harvey Oswald. Turns out Sean Munger has made 2 feature-length YouTube videos that are about, actually, so the first one is Let Me Know, is the guy that all he did was he made a very well made video about about the assassination itself and all of the stuff that happened at the book depository, right? Who saw what did people testify towards, all this other stuff. His thing was, he was like, Lee Harvey Oswald got that job at the book depository from his wife, who was living with a friend with a neighbor, and whose neighbor's sister's husband got a job at the book depository, and they just happened to have a conversation about it. And Lee Harvey Oswald was looking for a job, and she was like, "Oh, I'll give you the number." And it's like, how does a criminal conspiracy? How does this crazy conspiracy happen to put JFK? Or to put Lee Harvey Oswald, this assassin, in the sights of JFK, but the way that he got this job was insanely coincidental, right? Other details like the route through Dealey Plaza was actually a big point of contention, and it wasn't solidified until 6 days prior. They just knew that, you know, JFK was going to be going through Dallas, but there wasn't a published route until a couple of days prior. Just like a million of these like small coincidental things, but the thing that like the human brain is built for is pattern recognition, right? It is, you know, the seeing most of a circle and intuiting the rest of it to make a, you know, I'm sorry, I'm doing a poor job of explaining this. The human brain looks at this image and sees a circle, right? Even though this is not touching, right? It's because we have pattern recognition to know, oh, the curve is going to continue, and this implies the circle will complete, right? This is the most basic form of pattern recognition that like humans have. And so whenever there's just like a bunch of coincidental bullshit, people want to like fill in those details with because, right? Because of that sort of like pattern recognition. Anyway, Sean Munger goes in this huge thing. It's a 4-hour video. He debunks literally every single conspiracy theory with just like the most insanely detailed evidence. It was great. And then he has a bunch of other videos. But really what it comes down to that I love about this guy is he's just like the most happy. Yeah, did you ever have a teacher like this in high school who just like fucking loved teaching history or like whatever it was, chemistry? He's like that. It's like sitting in that guy's class again, right? Sean Munger fucking like cares a lot about this stuff, and he has all of those interesting dumb little details that like make a lecture like, I don't know, stick in your head. He has a bunch of other videos, one of them about Iran Contra, which I actually really appreciated because the details of that have always been like hazy. He has another one about I don't know, just a bunch of stuff. So that.
Yep. So, funnily enough, in kind of like the area of pattern recognition, I watched a video recently by, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I'll have to find it, about basically child speech recognition, which I thought was interesting. It's like, do you know what a wug is?
Mm-mm.
So a wug isn't a real thing. It's like somebody drew a picture of like a bird, right? Like a bird looking thing, and goes to a bunch of children. This is a psychology experiment, says, or a linguistics experiment maybe. Says, this is a wug. If there are more than one of them, there are several, and like kids can do wugs, right? Like they get most of that, right? Like they essentially they pluralize wug to wugs without explicitly knowing that that's the rule. Essentially,
Oh, sure.
Which
Yeah.
is the big insight, right? And like they can do this across a variety of things, right? Like one of the one that's harder that doesn't come through as often is you know, it's a picture of a man doing something. It's like, this man is gronging, right? Or this man grongs, he is gronging. Yesterday he, and then that one is like, you know, it's either an adult would say like gronged or grang, right? But like the kids were a little bit less good at that kind of thing, right? And so there's a bunch of study around like what parts of language that kids intuitively pick up from the parent language, right? Because like this like replicates across languages, but like in like different ways, right? Like, you know, different languages pluralize words differently, and kids will like pluralize wug in the way that they're supposed to pluralize wug in a different language, right? Like they won't all say wugs, right? Which is like an important thing, because what was the guy saying? So the interesting findings here are, one, that like, you know, it's like the big important thing is it's not rote memorization, right? It's not that, because like this bug experiment happened in the 60s, I think, but it's not that kids memorize like all the things that are happening around them. They like intuitively pick up on the rules and can apply them forward in a way, right? It's not rote memorization.
Yeah, this is like Coco the gorilla stuff, right?
Yeah.
Coco the gorilla didn't learn sign language. Coco the gorilla it's essentially the same thing was happening in Coco's head that happens in your dog's head when you pick up a leash, right? Your dog sees that and thinks walk. They understand walk, right? And they'll react to the word walk, but it's just because they have a very basic and crude association between the object and the action, right? But picking up on advanced language and linguistic techniques like sentence structure and stuff like that is something that is truly uniquely human, right? And there's a lot of stuff that only humans do, like um, animals can't talk to themselves in the way, or I'm sorry, like one of the ways we know Coco the gorilla did not actually know, could not speak English, did not know sign language, was Coco would never sign to herself, right? But deaf kids who learn sign language will, right? Which is an interesting, like a really interesting observation. There's a bunch of other stuff with that is like actually crazy too, right? Like in sign language, rhymes are signs that look similar to one another. Which is like a thing that I had no idea was like real. There's a ton of this kind of stuff linguistically that it just like boggles my brain. Uh,
Yeah, no, it's funny. Recently, I forget why I was having this discussion, but I was like, I bet you the Quebec, like the Quebecois have their own version of sign language, and they do. But the part of the thing that's like interesting there is that it's derivative of English Sign Language because English Sign Language is derivative of French Sign Language. Yeah. Which is like a thing. It's like a Wikipedia hole I fell down at one point. It's like, I'm curious about, it's like, it started with the seed of like, I bet you the Quebecois have their own sign language because of course they fucking would. Because they're weird about their language, right? Like, but like it fell in a rabbit hole of like reading about sign language. Cause like, I had always assumed that sign language was like a transliteration of like English, but it's not.
Oh
It's got its own like unique grammar and whatnot, which is interesting, right? Like,
yeah. No, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of that stuff because there's stuff that happens in other languages that, right? Where like Japanese has particles, right? Which is kind of like spoken or spoken punctuation, right? And then there's a lot of stuff linguistically that happens in English that doesn't happen in other languages, right? For instance, the English, I think the most unique sound in English is the English R sound, or I'm sorry, in American English, because even other, English speakers, it's like the way that we make the R sound is unique worldwide, apparently. And there's just like a bunch of stuff with like the phonetic implications of stuff like that, right? This is something I always key in on when I'm trying to do accents for characters at D&D. Like Mateo's accent, I'm trying to do a Spanish accent, right? And one of the ways that you do a Spanish accent is you condense your vowels, because English has 12 vowel sounds, but Spanish only has 5, right? It is a, I, E, O, U, right? And every word needs to conform to these 5 vowels. So let me think. So if I'm Mateo, the word ship is sheep, right? Which is the same word as sheep, obviously. It's the same pronunciation as sheep. But like you learn those tricks, and that's how you can teach yourself, like, I don't know, accents.
hold on, I need to Google something. This is a thing that I thought was like super funny. I'm gonna be careful about this. I know some stuff about the way that basically certain voice assistants do things.
Oh, interesting. Because of your project, right?
No, actually, you know what? I'm not going to talk about this. This is getting too close to stuff that might get me in trouble.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
We're over anyway, so we can leave it here. Saying, okay, words have connotations and definitions.
A thing I saw on YouTube that I can definitely talk about is I watched another video by a different linguist talking about I think it's like it's like a younger Australian thing where they say or nor instead of
I think I watched this video. Yeah. Hold on, where it's the guy and he's bald. He's like old and British and bald, and he talks about the okay,
or nor clear,
yeah.
Well, it's funny because my girlfriend will say like or nor to me. I'm like, what is this from? It's like, oh, it's from like this mermaid show, and it's like
it's funny. The reason I learned that guy was because of vocal fry. Right.
Oh.
Which is the vocal fry is the like, oh, that sounds so great.
Well, most famously, Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to bring it full circle, has a medical condition that gives him like very bad vocal fry.
Really? I
Yeah.
actually did not know that.
Have you never heard him speak?
I don't know that I ever have. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I've never heard him speak. I do. Men have vocal fry. A lot of male announcers use vocal fry, or not announcers, but like narrators, because when you drop your voice really deep, you naturally get a vocal fry on the undertones. And so, if you're listening to like a YouTube video, a lot of the time YouTube videos, with like deep male voices have a lot of vocal fry on them, which is I think of vocal fry as being a thing that like young American women do, right? But it was interesting to hear him be like, "Oh no, actually."
Yeah, I always think of it of like Jimmy Stewart, I guess, right? Like, you know, like, oh, yeah, or maybe Don Knotts, right? Like that kind of like, oh boy, I don't know what's happening, right? Like,
Yeah, that's pretty funny. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you're about to drag me into another thing, which is like I have on my Twitter seen recently, like, the newest version of like, what's it called? Like, Chad versus incel discourse is like the pitch of your voice, and someone made a website that like is like measures the frequency of your voice and tells you if you're like a certified Chad or a no hope incel.
At a certain point, that's got to be trolling, right? That's like that is the most troll bait I feel like I've ever heard. Oh my god. Okay, now we're super over.
Yeah, we're super over. We're talking about nonsense. If you'd like to email us about
some Derps talk about language, okay?
Yeah, some Derps talk about vocal fry. If you want to email us about anything you talked about this podcast, from wizards to vocal fry, you can email us at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@somederpsplaygames.com. You can follow us at twitch.tv/somederpsplaygames, where these go out live, as well as youtube.com/somederpsplaygames. Rate reviews wherever you find podcasts, all that good stuff. Buddy, you have anything else you're looking to promote?
I do want to promote. I have 2 games to promote. Okay, Mango, because we're launching 2 games in 2 weeks. Are you ready for this? On this Thursday, September 14th, we are launching Behind the Frame VR. This is a PSVR 2 title, where we took our, I don't know, hit game Behind the Frame, very well received, beautiful indie game from a Taiwanese studio. We took that game and we put it into VR. It's now a VR game. And then the second game, and the one that I have talked about a bunch on the podcast, and we're going to do a podcast episode, I'm sure, is on Astrea, Six-Sided Oracles, which comes out next week on September 21st. This is the dice deck building roguelike, which I'm very excited for everyone to get their hands on and really go deep on. I have so many thoughts. I have like the most insane thoughts about Astrea. That podcast is going to be super fun.
Yeah. You know, this is a closing thought. We talked all about conspiracy theories, and we didn't talk about jet fuel can't melt steel beams.
Oh my god. Oh, holy fuck. That one also bugs me. I saw a video on Reddit today that was debunking that by 2 minutes by a blacksmith. He was like, let me just prove this point to you. Yes, jet fuel burns at 1500 degrees and steel melts at 2600 degrees or whatever. But you want to know what happens when steel gets heated up to 1500 degrees? He pulls out a big steel bar and he puts it in an anvil and starts wiggling it around because it's like basically a noodle, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners, except for the lizard people. The lizard people, you guys can stay, and we're gonna keep doing. This is our Illuminati meeting.
Secret podcast.